Dr. Alan Feldman is an associate professor of media culture and communication at NYU as a cultural anthropologist. And I met him, well, I fell for him when I read the book Formations of Violence, the narrative of the body and political terror in Northern Ireland. He published in 1991. It stands for me as one of the seminal books that takes seriously the relationship between the materiality of language. And he has a phrase in there that's fantastic. He talks about the materiality of meaning and the subjectivity of the physical. And it's just beautiful. So I've been tracing and tracking and reading Dr. Feldman's work since then. So I'm really delighted that he could come down today and give this lecture, which has actually been rescheduled from Hurricane Sandy. We were scheduled to have it in the fall. And share with us some of his new research on Guantanamo Bay. And before you get started, maybe we just do just a quick go-round so you know who's in the room. Kevin.
I'm Ken Arick. We've been chatting a bit. I'm also an anthropologist and a teacher.
Grace Chow, a master's student here.
Caitlin Conway, also a master's student.
And I'm Annalisa De Vitis. I'm a research scholar in media and communication and conflict.
And I'm Richard Rubenstein. I'm a faculty member here. Not an anthropologist.
So I want to thank Sarah and the Center for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity to probably talk about a relatively new direction, though it's still very connected to situated acts of violence from which I've been known to deal with ethnographically. But as you know, the war on terror makes it ethically problematic to perform ethnography. And my approach to the war on terror since 2001 is to treat it as an Americanist project, to an American public culture, political sphere. When I was doing, I don't know if you know much about the trajectory of my work. A lot of people know about my work in Northern Ireland, but from about the mid-90s to early 2000s, I did ethnography over a period of 4 years, 5 years, with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. During that period, I used to hang out with the legal analysts at the commission, who were, they were the people who prepared the bundles of evidence. The Truth Commission was not a strictly juridical project, though aspects of it were, particularly the amnesty hearings. But they would meet in a workshop periodically, and one of the things I did with that group, and I was constantly working behind the scenes. In fact, the whole time I was there, I never met a truth commissioner. All the legal scholars would go and fly in, spend a week to 2 weeks, and meet Desmond Tutu, Alec Borain, and a whole bunch of other very famous folks, and then fly out. And they knew about it. Well, I spent a lot of my time not only with witnesses and going back to their home communities, but with guys who were behind and women behind the scene, witness handlers, simultaneous translators, and these legal experts. And they would often sit around and discuss what new law was being made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not treating the commission as a simple linear extension of existing humanitarian law or human rights violation law or discourse. And so my approach to the war on terror, you're probably familiar with some of these dichotomies. Usually there's two basic approaches. You have legal theorists and other scholars, even those who study what I'm going to be talking about today, who talk about how the process of Guantanamo, interrogation, torture, so-called enhanced interrogation, extraordinary renditions, black sites, and all that stuff, is a violation of due process and existing canons of common law and American proceduralism, American legal proceduralism, or you get the kind of, I'd say, crude left-wing response, maybe not so left-wing, who knows, that evokes the work of Carl Schmitt, and basically says it's a state of exception, that the norm has been suspended. And rather than, and both those discourses have at their premise that an existing norm has been suspended or violated and either one can return to it, or we recognize that the government is always going to be in a state of transgression in terms of law. My approach, in part, even though this might not be recognized as legality or typical conventional legal theory, is to focus on what new legal forms are emerging from this process that may often, more often not even recognized as legal forms, but in terms of their effective practices, how they impact on people's lives and bodies, they are forms of legality. So I'm looking at what's called the Combatant Status Review Tribunals, which were held in Guantanamo from 2002 to 2005, until they were not, people think they were ended, but they were not terminated, they were suspended by the Obama administration, and in which the detainees in Guantanamo were basically being subjected to a tribunal inquiry to ascertain that at the point at which they were captured, usually in Afghanistan, sometimes in Iraq, and sometimes they were rendered by other countries to American authorities, were they in arms against the United States, and were they armed combatants against the United States? Now, this is a very crucial legal distinction, because even though there's never been a declaration of war against Taliban or Al-Qaeda or even Saddam Hussein, just recently, representatives from the Guantanamo apparatus have defended that as long as the United States is in combat, they evoke this law that people captured as enemy combatants do not have to be released; they can be kept in custody as long as the war goes on. Even though this is a war that's never been declared and has never promised a final criteria of its termination. So it's a war, as I like to describe, as a means without end. So I'm interested in one particular. So these hearings were transcribed, and legal advocates for many of the detainees in Guantanamo through FOI petitions managed to get these transcripts released to the public. And there's about 500 or more transcripts, and they're online. You can get a hold of them. This is one that I was working with, of Ashraf Salim Abd al-Salam. He was a Libyan. He was a school teacher in Libya, captured by the American forces in Afghanistan in 2001, and in prison in Guantanamo since 2002 until 2010, where he was rendered to Georgia, the country Georgia, in some type of lower security type of house arrest, and has disappeared. I mean, I cannot find him after he's sent to Georgia. Now, in the interim, of course, he was part of a revolutionary group that was especially anti-Gaddafi. It was an Islamicist group, but the Gaddafi regime has been overthrown, and the party that he was affiliated with is now a legal party in the Libyan parliament, but we don't know what happened to him. But certainly that should affect his legal status and speak to his possible repatriation. So his group is called the Islamic Fighting Group. Now, describe what these tribunals were like. They consisted of 3 judges, a lead judge and 2 assistant judges, a translator, a stenographer or a transcriber, and someone called a personal representative, who was neither representative of the detainee nor had any personal connection with him. Legal advocates were barred, from these hearings. The hearings, in terms of the evidentiary structure, were based on 2 types of documents: classified information, to which the detainee had absolutely no access. In fact, my sense is that even the tribunal officers only saw the classificatory material after they conducted the official tribunal and made their final adjudication, so they wouldn't back and give away any classified information to the detainee. So the detainee was exposed to or declassified information, but that was only part of his adjudication, and that disjuncture between public information and the secret information is really what this discussion revolves around. here. And the prisoners were informed that they would be tried on inaccessible, classified information. Sometimes they received redacted summaries, but more often than not, they never received it. The inmates were not, detainees were not, by and large, not allowed to call witnesses except other detainees who were already incarcerated in Guantanamo. So Mark Denbow, who was a counselor for two of the detainees and a professor of law at Seton Hall University, and the author of a principal investigator of a human rights report on CSRT, concluded that the government, through the procedure, the CSRT procedure, was attempting to replace habeas corpus with what he termed a no hearing protocol that did not meet the requirements of due process. And he has an extensive, interesting essay on that with evidence. So what I'm interested here is actually where he ends, which is this notion of a no hearing. In other words, this notion of a process that's internally contradicted, or I would use the technical term from philosophy, is a denegation, right? A denegation is negation that negates itself, right? And does not resolve into any higher synthesis, like as you would associate with either Marx or more even frequently with Hegel. It just goes on negating itself, and it never resolves into a determinate, positive presence of stability. So almost from the start of his 2004 hearing, Ashraf Salim questioned the conditions under which the classified information was being deployed against him. And this was not well received by the tribunal, who at the start of the hearing preemptively warned Salim against any emotional outburst and disruptive behavior and threatened to remove him from the hearing. So this is be reading little transcripts of the hearing for you. So this is the tribunal president. You may be present at all open sessions of the tribunal. However, if you become disorderly, you will be removed from the hearing, and the tribunal will come. And he's interrupted by Salim, right? Before she can, and it's a woman who's the president of the tribunal. He says before she can continue her sentence, and the detainee says, "How would I disturb order?" And the president responds, "By becoming too emotional, not listening to the tribunal. If you become disorderly, you'll be removed from the tribunal, and the tribunal will continue to hear evidence in your absence." Now, the warning for the tribunal was in part due, I think, to Salim's record, which is online, his behavior record at Guantanamo prior to the hearing, but also continuing long after the hearing until about 2010, where he was rendered to Georgia. So here's an excerpt from that disciplinary record. Quote, "His overall behavior has been sporadically compliant and hostile to the guard force and staff. Detainee currently has 45 reports of disciplinary infraction listed on the DMIS, with the most recent occurring on the 1st of April 2008. So this is a report that's been made after the hearing, but it goes back to behavioral infractions concurrent with the hearing, when he failed to follow guard instructions. He has 2 reports of disciplinary infraction for assault, with the most recent occurring in March 29, 2008, when he attempted to break a guard's arms. Other instances for which he has been disciplined include inciting and participating in mass disturbances, failure to follow guard instructions and camp rules, inappropriate use of bodily fluids, something I relate to, because if you know my work, I did a whole study of the dirt protest in Northern Ireland, the British jails, where body fluids, particularly fecal matter, was used as a part of resistance movement. Failure to follow guard instructions and camp rules, destruction of government property, attempted assaults, provoking words and gestures, and possessions of food and non-weapon type contraband. He had a total of 6 reports of disciplinary infraction in the last year, 2008. So his reaction to his detention and Salim and his condition of imprisonment can be inferred from the record. In the hearings, there is no testimony taken concerning the conditions under which someone like Salim was being imprisoned, nor the conditions under which prior interrogations of the prisoner were conducted. Through his behavior record, which was not directly raised to Salim in the face-to-face tribunal encounter, one crucial and rhetoricized criteria of judgment was the abducted prisoner's compliance or non-compliance with the regime of abduction prior to any definitive assignment of the prisoner's combatant status. In other words, even though the hearings were supposed to be ascertaining only whether or not he was in arms against American forces, the fact that he has these behavioral infractions counts against him. So here we find a juridical apparatus. I'm setting the scene for the tribunal itself and why this is very important. So here we find the juridical apparatus at Guantanamo all but confessing that it's engaged in the manufacturing of a security risk through the technologies of incarceration. This unwritten protocol provides a crucial context for the tribunal process. The production of a subject, here we have the production of a subject rendered adequate to the justifiability of capture through the conditions of incarceration. And this explains why discussions of the release of Guantanamo inmates are short-circuited by the dogma of the post-release return to terror. So here, we're not dealing with a rehabilitative prison regime. That's what you have to recognize. The concept of immaterial labor theory, I'm thinking of the work of Paolo Vierno and Maurizio Lazzarato, Italian Marxists, who are dealing with the new conditions of capitalist production, which you talk about immaterial labor, cognitive labor, or cognitive capitalism, which is give you a sense of what they're talking about. The concepts of immaterial labor theory can illuminate this post-Fordist, post-rehabilitative disciplinary regime at Guantanamo. The future interior of the return to terror motif is what drives the CSRT inquiry. This becomes the immaterial labor of the black site as a machine that mobilizes the self-valorization of the war on terror. The manufacture of culpability at Guantanamo is immaterial as it does not produce objects or end projects, but rather actions as ends in themselves. Immaterial penal labor can be understood as, and these are terms that are coming out of Italian Marxist labor theory, can be understood, immaterial labor in the penal labor in Guantanamo can be understood as managed productive cooperation, where detainees become active subjects in the coordination of the various functions of the Guantanamo apparatus, which is not to reform or to rehabilitate. Guantanamo, as a post-Fordist prison, produces the entrepreneurial autonomy of resistant, non-responsive terrorists through conditions that promote the detainees' non-compliance with their immediate detention as their mode of compliance to the war on terror. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay? Non-compliance in the prison helps reproduce the war on terror and its ideological myths and metaphysics. So it's moot whether or not the person returns to terror or not. What is crucial here is the compiling and encoding of behavioral infractions as opposing of recursive terror through these infractions. And basically, Verno calls this process the inventive repertoire of misconduct ascribed to Salim by his captors constitutes an autonomous, productive synergy which communicates with the notion of immaterial and effective labor under cognitive capitalism as a manufacture and subjectifying of cultural economic virtuosity. So he's a virtuoso resistor, right, to the regime. This virtuosity is a mode of surplus repression, so by the Marxists, through participative management as a technology of power, as a technology for creating and controlling the subjective processes. Here, in other words, in Italian immaterial labor theory, the subject of production is always the production of subjects. Okay? They theorize that the factory is no longer producing goods and articles, it's producing subjects who can operate the factory. You know, and they have a whole discussion of flexible or precarious labor, which you can refer to. Now, Salim was informed that he'd be tried on documents partially. So basically what's happening here is that this kind of culpabilization of the inmate, even prior to the tribunal hearing, means that the adjudication of guilt or innocence is merely a procedural immediacy, not a finality. It's just a means to another end, which lies outside the tribunal, which is the ideological reproduction of the war on terror via the treatment of the bodies of so-called incarcerated or detained terrorists. Now, Salim was informed that he would be tried on documents partly masked for security reasons to which he'd have no direct or indirect access. And he says, when he's told that, he responds, "We are getting into things classified and unclassified. All this is just about me proving what I did. If I did the things I did, I would admit that I did. And here, his voice is very important to hear, even though this is a transcribed voice, and we have no authentication of it beyond the transcript. And it's also a translated voice as well, because we're dealing with a translator who's transcribing his Arabic into English. But still, his character sneaks through, and I'll talk about that in a moment, in terms of the methodological issue that these transcripts pose. So, if I did the things I did, I would admit that I did them. Things I didn't do, I would say clearly I didn't do them. But the tribunal is saying there are classified things, classified information, they have to prove that. I'm not asking to see the witnesses if you have any. I just need to see their names to prove your documents are true. I think this is not justice if you accuse someone based on the classified information. This is not justice, it is not right. It hasn't been witnessed in the whole of human history. If you base your judgment or the accusations against me on classified information, then there's no need to continue. Let us stop right there. And then the tribunal president says to Salim, I have classified information that is being presented by the government. If we release all that information, it would cause harm to the national security of the United States. The detainee says, what harm or danger could you expect from someone in shackles who cannot even move like me? And basically, there are photographs that show these hearings, not with anybody in the room, just the empty hearing room. And the detainee's chair is a plastic chair, usually positioned near the floor where it's positioned. There's a kind of bolt, and there's a chain attached to the bolt. So when he goes, when he enters the room, he's shackled to this chain, which is bolted to the floor. So here, in that disclosure of him being shackled, Salim manages to embody himself in the transcript, which smuggled in the determining limits into which he appears and speaks at the hearing. The tribunal president then reminded Salim that he could call witnesses, which turned out to be another evocation of the inaccessible, along with the classified documents. Salim stated he did not want to go through his personal representative, this guy who's not a personal representative, to contact a witness, but sought to personally contact witnesses. Tribunal president, we must involve the U.S. government to communicate with your government. In this case, when he says your government, he's inferring the Gaddafi regime, to find the witnesses. The detainee, I guess they will not contact these people, but Gaddafi will imprison them. As far as I know, in all the history of the human race, I do not think there have been any tribunals of this form or this kind. You swear to do your job rightfully and just. Unfortunately, now you're just following orders or a predetermined way of conducting this hearing. Tribunal president, Salim, you are correct. There is a higher authority, and we are obliged to follow the rule of this tribunal. I cannot change the rules of this tribunal. Salim, I know my fate is already predetermined, and the judgment has been pronounced already. This tribunal is just for show, and it's not real. Everybody is reading from papers that are already printed, and everything's already predetermined. I know for sure my destiny is already determined. The judgment against me is already made up. My presence, me defending myself or not defending myself, will have no importance whatsoever. One thing is this, then he stops, he says, one thing is this unclassified document, referring to the unclassified summary of evidence to which he has access to. What the personal representative showed me, I guess prior to the trial, or is it something else? And the president says, yes, that is the unclassified summary of evidence. And Salim responds, there is no proof of this, so give me the proof. So he's now challenging the authenticity or the credentials of even the unclassified information. The president then asks Salim if he consents to participate in the hearing or not. Salim responds, before I answer this question, I'd like to ask one more question. The classified information, is it going to stay classified, and until when? And the tribunal president answers, it will stay classified forever. Absolute. And the detainee says, I will have no chance to take a look at the information. The tribunal president answers, no. Salim, you're telling me that you have classified information of classified proof, and I'm not allowed to read or see it. So where is the justice here? Tribunal president Ashraf Salim, do you want to participate in the tribunal? Yes or no? No, not in this way. I want to participate in a just way, not this way. At that point, they remove him from the room. They meet in camera, session. they peruse the classified information that he had no access to, and they reached a conclusion, which was reinforced by subsequent reviews of his case, that one, he was a high risk as he's likely to pose a threat to U.S. its interests and allies, and therefore stays incarcerated. Two, he's a high threat from a detention perspective, so here's where the behavioral infractions come into play. And three, he's of medium intelligence value, and this is a Department of Defense document that got reviewed and revised. This is the latest version of this 2008. Now, Dan Bowles' report and other legal reports on the CSRT focuses on the deficits of due process in the tribunal.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Did they find that he was in arms or not? They found that he was in arms.
Based on the classified information.
Thank you.
But the issue here, and we can discuss this afterwards, is that when they said that someone was in arms against the United States or its allies, that's very crucial, because some of these guys were in arms against what was called the Northern Alliance, which was fighting the Taliban, but which was prior to the American invasion of Afghanistan. Suddenly they find themselves with that invasion de facto adversaries of the American forces who are in alliance with the so-called Northern Alliance. Right? So this is one of the trick dimensions of determination. So the legal approach focuses on the deficits of the process. However, my concern is precisely with the denegation captured by Dan Brown's title, a no hearing, as being intrinsic to the political efficacy of a securitized state practicing a politics of the inappropriable. Denegation is a negation that negates itself and which permits no affirmative resolution. It is a nomination that simultaneously unnames itself, an enunciation that renunciates itself. Denegation acts for meanings and signs that are not fully constituted predicates. It's a mode of repetition as an autonomic movement in time that duplicates the unrepeatable. And I can go on discussing this, but we can bring that more out in the Q&A. I associate the performative structure of denegation with what I like to call disframing, in the sense that the Guantanamo tribunals perform sovereignty, American sovereignty, as a discontinuous assemblage of law, war, and securitization, an economy of gestures shaped by strategies of apparition and disapparition. The performative structure of these tribunals express sovereignty in the war and terror as a figuration that both imparts and departs from its enclosure in law, just war, and due process. The political witness is confronted here with a diagrammatic of deframing or disframing. And this is a cinema theory here, and I quote from Pierre Audard. The quote, "The radical off-centeredness of a point of view that mutilates the body and expels it beyond the frame to focus instead on dead, empty zones. The use of the frame as a cutting edge, the living pushed out of the periphery beyond the frame, the focusing on the bleak and dead sections of the scene." So I'm going to argue here that through legal, military, technocratic, and aesthetic performances, the counter-terrorist state is actualized through instituted procedural breaches as fields of indeterminacy through which political determination is paradoxically achieved. So I'm
Could you say that sentence again?
that the counterinsurgency state is actualized through procedural breaches as fields of indeterminacy through which political determination is paradoxically achieved. There is no strict opposition here between inframing and disframing in these tribunals. The state, as a regime of denegation, does not omit or preclude that which lies outside an instituted frame, silencing and repressing. Rather, I would argue, the state presents itself as a broken frame, as the broken middle or immediacy, as that which frames only in the breaking of frames. Okay, again, another paradox that I'm proposing here. And implicitly, this is a critique of Judith Butler's book called Frames of War, where things are either inside or outside the frame. And I'm talking about broken frames which are leaking everywhere. Okay? And they're intentionally being constituted, they're not accidents. Any analysis of state gesture and performances in the CSRT event need take into account the replication of sovereignty through disframing as a demediatization of impartability, in which apparent media, as the ethics of just war, the means, ends, ratios of goal-directed action, procedural formalism through which a sovereign right is claimed, are both presented and then negated or suspended. Now, my report here cannot, my reading here cannot report with much veracity on the event of the trial or the state of mind of Ashraf Salim. So this is the methodological limit that we have to recognize and be candid about. But only respond to the artifactuality of the transcript itself as a lucid fragment of institutional memory and stratigraphy, which can be possibly read against the grain, an intervention and excavation that the transcribed Salim appears to imply and to map, at least as evidenced in the transcript. Now, it's crucial also not to forget that the Ashraf Salim who appears in the transcript is a juridical fiction, authored by the transcript and by the CSRT process. Yet there are moments of rupture and reversal in this far from seamless document where the juridical fiction can be seen to appropriate itself as such, as a fiction, to grasp its fictive existence in the procedure in a chiasmus where this fiction breaks with the authoring machine that is the tribunal and becomes self-authoring. I'll try to tease out those moments for you. Now, chiasmatic reversal erupts at precisely those junctures where the ghost writing author of this particular juridical fiction is unveiled as absent, the secret document that sentences Salim to a culpable biography. The transcribed Salim rejects any transcendental status of the secret and any external authorial locus of law or of his subjects. Authorial agency is deposed by Salim in his testimony as an internal relation imminent to the tribunal process by which the tribunal authorizes itself as law through negation of law, despite its transcendental claims, evasions, and allusions to higher authorities and higher authorizations. Now, the other thing I want you to think about here is the tribunal process itself, which does communicate with anybody who's working on issues like transitional justice or war crimes tribunals. The tribunal format is pertinent, for as opposed to a court, which tends to inquire after a particular act or sequence of actions, a tribunal puts the historical character of the accused in its entirety on trial. You mentioned Milosevic earlier, and reciprocally puts into play the historical character of the state or the authority that tries in this manner. I'm thinking here of the Moscow trials, particularly. A tribunal is the assemblage of an inventory of all that which the accused possesses or does not possess in relation to all that which the state claims to possess de jure in its claim to procedural reason. A question here is legal title for which the state claims to possess de jure. A question here is legal title to the law itself. Okay? What is the state's legal title to the law itself in the CSRT procedure? So a question here is legal title to the law itself, screened behind the question of empirical versus de jure possession, right? The state is acting as if it's lawful, whether or not it's authorized to act in such a way, and whether that action can be grounded in a pre-constituted legal apparatus. This is a question of dominion, of the relation of jurisdiction to authority, and of the intelligible ground upon which legal title to law resides. So here I'm backing up in the tribunal and not just looking at it in terms of its declared instrumental function, whether or not Salim was a combatant against the U.S., but whether this is a tribunal that can claim legal title to legality in and of itself. This is a question of dominion itself, of the relation of jurisdiction to authority, and of the intelligible ground upon which legal title to law resides, if it resides on anything other than the right of necessity as a right of coercion without any right. Here we can think of regime change or in Iraq or Afghanistan. The right of necessity is always a coercive right that has no pre-existing legal right. This situates the litigation of legal title to law at a crucial juncture. Salim is the possession of the CSRT. And under natural law, the state of being in possession requires no authentication as a fact upon the ground, as a fact that is its own ground. To dispute the natural right to what is already in possession, which he does, which I'm going to try to do, is to dispute jurisdiction, which in this case is to dispute both the freedom and necessity of the state as the latter's autonomous and law-constituting ascription of what is necessary to it as an exercise in state reason. So we're dealing with an exercise in state reason, and rather than putting Salim on trial, Salim, and I'm following his footsteps, putting the state on trial, okay, through this procedure. So in the absence of a truly personal representative, I'm compelled to call to stand another juridical fiction, Franz Kafka, and I hope you've read this little parable of his, Before the Law. I'm going to be referring to it frequently. From this highly mediated transcript that Salim might never have seen, it can be inferred that the shackled prisoner, like Kafka's countrymen in this fable, is in fact, in his fable of justice deferred, this countryman is immobilized before the law. Okay? So what does it mean to be immobilized before the law? And in Kafka, being before the law does not mean only in being in front of a tribunal, but actually being in a space before the law arrives. Okay? That's what you have to understand is a topological or spatial model of law that's demonstrated. In turn, the tribunal, repeating the posture of the gatekeeper of the house of law in Kafka's story, sits not within law, but with its back to law, as an exterior checkpoint to the presumed interiority of law. The two positions replicate the performative site of a fundamentally concussed topos that divorces the heading, the title of the essay, Before the Law, the incipit, from the synoptic sequence, the narrative of inaccessibility and unreadability, wherein the law of this text, Kafka's text, can be read as a text of law. So the two protagonists in Kafka's text, but also in the tribunal, are both attended before the law, but in opposition to one another, being on either side of a line of inversion, whose mark in the text is precisely the separation of the title from the narrative body. And this scene gives us a kind of topographical system of law that prescribes two inverse and adverse positions, the antagonisms of two characters equally concerned with law, and the fact that neither faces the law, right? The law, the other who faces the law, Salim, or the countryman in Kafka's story, is no more present to the law than the one who turns his back to it, the tribunal or Kafka's gatekeeper. Neither is in the presence of the law in Kafka's story. Now, the Guantanamo Tribunal performs in the transcript as the gateway that bars Salim from law and sits as an antechamber, a chancery, where Salim is deposed outside of law, which has no topos or aparity or openness for him. Salim recognizes his atopic relation to the law and law's distance from him in the exhibition of an inhibition, the imperviousness and violence of the letter. The classified text as a public secret is an unveiling of what cannot be unveiled, right? We have a secret. It's an unveiling of what cannot be unveiled. It's power lies in its access to visibility. The classified document presents to Salim a recto of blank facelessness, whose verso also obstructs any opening onto law due to the secret's presumptive evidentiary validity, its immunity to the burden of proof. The public secret functions topographically as it separates Salim from access to due process and reciprocally guards the tribunal from the arrival of positive law. The tribunal sits on the redundancy of a pure performativity that is nothing more than the event of a sitting. In its invocation of higher or eccentric authorities who predetermine its performativity ahead of its time, the tribunal confesses its non-identity with itself, as indexed by the rapidly receding ground against which the blurred juridical figure appears. Section is called Frozen Doorways. So the CSRT cannot be deposed, but only preposed as an effectuation that is never in situ and never frameable, okay? And law here is also never frameable. It exemplifies this process of dynamic of disframing that I've been talking about. As in Kafka's fable, the Guantanamo Tribunal promises passageways, portals, or doorways to law that frame and support nothing. Their architectural juridical violence is the unframability of this abode of law, this anti-habitus of which they are a part, from which they are a part, right? You know, they're part of the law, but they're separate from the law, and yet they claim to part open the law, right? So these weird doors in Kafka's story, you know. The doors themselves are denegations. In Kafka and at Guantanamo, the existential promise of juridical passage as the promise of movement and change, of humanly inhabitable transition and translation from time and between time and spaces, is interdicted by these doorways that repel and resist the human form, whose outline and posture are anticipated and archived by this aperture of the doorway. So a doorway is something that is a habitus for the human body. These are doorways that repel any human body or human figure passing through their space, crossing their limbs. Kafka's doors are a structural inhospitality towards the human form, which the door commands, echoes, and mocks. In Kafka's tale, the law's applicant gradually loses his humanizing, upright posture and sight, which renders law's entryway all the more unapproachable and darkened, and the subjecthood all the more fragmentary and partial. In such shrinking humanity and expanding disability, he cannot even testify to his experience of being before a law with no discernible figure or ground. The less he sees of the law, the stronger is the radiance of light that emanates from law's thresholds, intensifying the blur of law's disapparition. There's a huge, this is tense light that emanates from the house of law that blinds the countrymen. In Kafka's law, humanity itself is but another doorway in a frame that cannot be entered or formally assumed. Anthropology, if it appears at all, arrives as a verdict that destroys its very presupposition. So, just looking at the time, I probably should skip over some sections. So let's move to the issue of the secret document, which is where Salim begins to focus his attention, and to which he begins to contest the whole process. The decipherment of the secret, this the unveiling of the unveiled, right? He's told there's a secret. The secret is announced as public, but it cannot be accessed, right? The decipherment of this non-event, because this is a non-event, right? There's a secret, but you can't see it, right? By the accused is barred, because as predeterminacy and predestination, the classified document admits of no interpretation proffered by a singularizing reading as a rereading and a rewriting as an illicit mimetic appropriation of an inaccessible yet monumentalized codification that treats the secret as a summit coinciding with sovereignty. It's just basically inaccessible. It's just out there. You know, it cannot be reached like the law. But it exists and is exercising a determinate force on Salim's fate. And he's saying that, I know my fate is predetermined by this secret. So here's the indeterminate element that is producing political determination. A certain astrological sovereignty of the secret of the sentencing text of the destinal is asserted here over and against Salim's potential reading, his will to decipherment and will to witnessing in a space where he commands nothing. And commanding no thing in the space of totalizing command, witnessing is a mode of impotentialized willing that wills nothing but itself, and in doing so, recursively witnesses the constitutive and conceptual void of pure command as empty of object and subject, which underwrites the juridical scene of the CSRT. And that's how we have to understand the secret, as a pure command that has no content, right? It's simply to say it's secret and you have no access to it. That's it. And that positions who you are. And that determines what's going to happen to you for the rest of your life. So here, via this discourse of the secret, the law appears but commands nothing at Guantanamo, in which very few things occur except by command. Law as an appearing non-event is separated from its reproduction and continuity in deliverable sentences, divorced from its mechanical reproduction in the procedural, here rendered detachable, autonomous, and self-legislating the whole tribunal process. Law retains its erratic integrity by doing nothing and by being nowhere. Okay? So law does absolutely nothing and cannot be located in this space. As in Kafka's House of Law, the only narrativity is that of the law's refusal of narrative, analogous to the CSRT's refusal of profane reading of The Secret. And if you read the story, one of the things that happens here in the parable is that the gatekeeper tells the supplicant, the countryman, well, there are other gatekeepers in there, and you can deal with them. Each one is more terrible than I am, and you have to go through a sequence of them. So basically, in Kafka, no gatekeeper holds or has the law. So the narrative of law is basically the narrative of law's withholding, of law's sequential or serial refusal. And at the same time, the tribunal is telling Salim that our procedures and our protocols are basically determined by higher authorities who are not present and cannot be accessed, right? So again, no one has or holds the law. It's just simply, and this kind of extends the image of the dysfunctional doorway, right? Because no doorway allows you to, there's doorways, they allow you to enter, they don't allow you to enter, and they go absolutely nowhere. They are gatekeepers. So the narrative of law here is the choreography, the gesture of law's withholding. Law holds on to its bare life of withholding law from others, and it holds on to the bare life of those from whom law is withheld. So I'll repeat that. Law here, in both Kafka's story and in this CSRT process, holds on to the bare life of withholding law from others, and holds on to those others, grips them in captivity, from whom law is withheld. So getting back to Salim trying to read the secret text, and what does that request, that desire, that demand to witness, right? What does that do to the tribunal? What does it say about the tribunal? He cannot be allowed the haptic felicity of a gaze over the secret text, because that elevation would provisionally situate him in at least a simulacral, if not an expropriating relationship to sovereignty, through a mimesis that was reserved for a mastering gaze and judgment, because that's who reads the text. It's the sovereign who's not present, is always absent, is invoked, but never there. Salim's reading would be a cutting incision and decision, an intolerable democratization of the text whose power lies in the display of its rarefaction, privation, and privity. The secret will not admit of another inscription mimetically borne by Salim's reading, who is only present at the tribunal to be read. That is why when he begins to astutely read and thereby to democratize the tribunal's process in itself, he's treated as non-responsive to his juridical point of insertion and as an uncommandable gaze and removed from the room. Who can read and decipher, and who cannot in Guantanamo, repeats the order of the prison as the architectural concentrate and textual surface of sovereignty. And here the tribunal itself is a holograph of this carceral gaze, a reference to Foucault's panopticon. So here, in the panopticon, you can be read, but you cannot read. From the perspective of the security state, the classified artifact cannot nor needs to be read by a singularizing and potentially democratizing gaze, but is already Salim's destiny, emanating from the sight and sight, S-I-T-E and S-I-G-H-T, of the absent other from whom the tribunal draws down its rules and constraints, as the Salim portrayed in the transcript correctly deduces. In this barring of decipherment, which performs the document's untouchability and its impassibility. This is an untouchable and impassible document. Its gaze cannot enter into it. Readability and unreadability are no longer mutually exclusive. And that's why I want to get at. Readability and unreadability, legibility and illegibility, and materiality and immateriality are no longer paradigms or polarities that have any pertinence here. The classified document is rendered unreadable precisely because it can be read. And in turn, presentifiable unreadability is both a bar and an invitation to decipherment. And therein lies its hegemonic radius as a denegation. You know, you announce a secret, right? That's a denegation. The prohibition on decipherment must be cast as the incitement and even a command to read as an interdictable event that best materializes the barbed border of the secret. He has to come up against the secret. That's a demonstration. That's a performativity of the power of the state, that he collides and has a collision with the secret. To the degree that the public secret is presented as infinite, unframeable, untouchable, and yet perpetually self-enclosed, it constitutes a media theology. The apocalyptic indifference of readability and unreadability in this media theology installs revealability without revelation, that suspends the dialectics of veiling and unveiling, performs a sheer revelation of revealability. Revealability without revelation signifies an agnosia of power, a theology and a pathology of transmission solely invested in the theatrocratic, the apophatic potency of the commanding power of impartibility, autonomous from and irreducible to any imparted specificity. Okay, so here we have impartibility with no content being imparted. And at a certain point in the tribunal, Salim is constantly trying to address this issue of impartibility without any impartable content. You're communicating something to me, but I don't know. It has no content. It has no evidentiary structure. He imposes he invokes an impossible utopian adjudication where the process, the judgment, the production of the evidentiary, the malleable and reversible locus of juridical repose, and the authenticity of juridical representation becomes the substance of an ultimately proscribed litigation by some, that Salim pursues. This challenge is propelled by Salim's apparent recognition that before the law, a witness cannot be a witness without arrest and self-incrimination, without a denegation that activates witnessing only to produce a commanding silence, including arrest, torture, imprisonment, and execution. Think of the witnesses who cannot be called without being arrested and imprisoned. Political juridical denegation needs to be witnessed in itself as a command in its purest form and barring any impartable content. The law and machinery of denegation turns witnessing here into something analogous to the secret. At this border, Gaddafi, in Salim's view, becomes one more shadowy gatekeeper of the law who will withhold the law by withholding those who might respond to Salim's call to testimony and to history. To be in a position to address history is to be judged as both being culpable of history and as witness, which in itself becomes a mode of objective guilt. This double bind of the witness who cannot historicize the prisoner without being penalized condemns Salim to prehistory. To be caught in the anteroom that's before the law is to be also to be before history, is to experience history as reversible creation, as time withdrawn and revoked, as a doorway shut. And I quote Walter Benjamin here on Kafka. In Kafka, the written law is contained in books, but these are secret. By basing itself on them, the prehistoric world exerts its rule all the more ruthlessly, end quote. The secret documents fulfills a parallel function to the witness who cannot be called to witness. It too is a denial of history, the inaccessibility of historicization of Salim and of its own historical becoming as a public secret. Salim's disputation attempts to break out from this anteroom of law by naming history itself, from which he has been exiled, as his witness. And I re-quote him, "As far as I know, in all the history of the human race, I do not think there have been any tribunals of this form, this kind," or, quote, "This is not justice, it is not right, it hasn't been witnessed in the whole of human history." So history itself is called as a witness into the tribunal. The Salim of record sees from the blindness that has been imposed on him when he claims a right not merely to view or dispute the content of the classified document, but to litigate the very actuality of the withheld text itself. Quote, "But if the tribunal is saying there are classified things, classified information, they have to prove that, unquote. Once the line between readability and unreadability is eviscerated, even the public secret can hide its non-existence, making it the secret of the secret. So he's saying, does the secret really exist? Is there a classified document to be held against me? Here Salim extends a burden of proof to the secret's very existence. He identifies and radicalizes the condition of textual disembodiment in law, identified by Pierre Lejeune, when he speaks of the decorporalization of the relation between commentator and text. It is means by this mechanism that gradually took hold in the West the institutional doctrine that a text is nothing more than a documentary bearer of information, kind of disembodiment of the text. Salim extends that to the disembodiment of the entire tribunal. Now, the secret archive held against Salim vibrates between the nominative and the infinitive. It's named, but we don't know what its content is. And as such, it homologizes the law in Kafka's fable, and ultimately the securitized state that imparts itself through a media theology of the incommunicable. Sovereignty here, like the secret, need remain both infinitely self-enclosed, yet unframeable, and thus manifests as the impartibility of no part. Violence also corresponds to this particular programmatization of the state at war, of the sovereign instance as a material imparting of the incommunicable. The trajectory of the event of revealability here in the war on terror was unilaterally from the unconditionality of the sovereign who shows, think of the drone weapons, right? The satellite imagery, to the conditionality of the death of those condemned to the revealable. Jacques Derrida theologically frames an unconditional sovereignty over revealability predicated on distance, indemnity, and veiling when he states, he's talking about God here, but I'm constantly transferring these attributes to the state. Quote, nothing can happen to absolute power to the sovereign. If something happens to God, it implies vulnerability to God. Absolute power is total insensitivity, total impassibility with regards to an event, end quote. However, this formulation implies a dialectic unnoted by Derrida, wherein sovereignty shows, performs, and materializes its impassibility and unconditionality by giving events to vulnerable others, which is to give or to demonstrate pure revealability, such as the monstrous exposure to violence and terror. Sovereignty over revealability is ruled by the purely apocalyptic. And apocalypse means to reveal, to uncover, to disclose. The sovereign can give the event or the time of revealability through fear, through violence, terror, and lore that takes time from those who are revealed, and instituting the vulnerability and destructibility of those to whom such events occur. The self-same gesture conversely permits no effective and conditioning event or time to touch, to sensitize, to pass through, or to affect sovereignty in its remotion and rarefaction. The drone plane or missile that flies over Afghani villages gives revealability to its acquired targets, while its faceless roboticism denies or at the very least radically withdraws any anthropological and effective origin to the events initiated by the prosthetic. This machinic privation of effective, sensible origination performs, as does Kafka's abode of law, the impassibility of sovereignty, its armored immunity to the juridical fate it renders to the non-sovereign other in its somatic expose. So, just to move to a conclusion, to kind of expand this more towards the wider war on terror. It's just the last page, bear with me, thank you for your patience. In a sentencing whose finality is delivered prior to Salim's official sentencing, he is told that the unreadable text, the tomb of his guilt, will be his fate forever, the fate of inaccessibility. In much the same manner that life rendered to Guantanamo will remain classified, culpable, and inaccessible as one of his endless sentences. Now, Salim is not sentenced to punishment, he's sentenced to guilt. That's what's going on here. It's a procedural sentencing. He's sentenced to the procedure of guilt. The narrative of Salim's life before the law is a sentencing to a life as a classificatory terrorist, as the infinitude of threat embodied in his institutionalized warehousing. Salim will remain inaccessible to himself. The lives of the prisoners in the debtors' prisons of Guantanamo, I remind you, in Nietzsche And in Walter Benjamin, guilt and debt, the German word Schuld, are linked together. In the lives of the prisoners in the debtors' prisons of Guantanamo, Bagram, and other black sites, it is not their life, but a transmitted encryption or accounting that they are commanded to assume and inhabit, like the handed-down prison jumpsuits, the uniform of culpability and indebtedness through which they are branded, tranched, and commensurated. Guilt, debt, as a chronometrical encryption, functions as a conserving crypt of history. The crypto-politics of debt and guilt in the war on terror is also the politics of the crypt itself as a valued form, such as the empty tomb of Ground Zero, that more that conserves and issues forth unending guilt debt as war credits that are banked in part with Guantanamo as a repository of historical culpability. Ground Zero is the archived abscess upon which the war on terror first swore its geo-political crusade of debt collection and regime repossession, and to which the populations of Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and the prisoners of Guantanamo and other black sites are held hostage in seemingly unending debt peonage. The liquidated and liquefied bin Laden and the Guantanamo inmate who was detained, adjudicated, and tortured as a legal indeterminacy. And here, discussing torture is not a matter of its criminality or its legality, but in Guantanamo and other black sites of maintaining and perpetuating its legal indeterminacy. So we can go on. So, people, the inmate who was adjudicated and tortured as a legal indeterminacy, or the liquefied and liquidated bin Laden, have all been immersed in unfathomable historical delinquency and liability, guilt and debt, drowning in and held captive to surplus culpability or indebtedness as historical regress without egress, which is why bin Laden could not have a locatable earthly grave, nor the Guantanamo inmate a public trial with due process. Such defaulties on historical time and the disruptive geopolities they evoke or implicate are sentenced not to punishment, but to guilt as a theological, fiscal chronicity, where they're denied finite juridical measure through the operative legalization of indeterminacy. Walter Benjamin described the time signature of indebting guilt as an archival hell, as a cosmos of punitive detention whose text, humanity, is condemned to copy out in countless repetitions and retentions. This hell is the governmentality of infinite culpability, the asymmetric power relations between creditor and debtor, that today colonially spreads its cultural isomorphism across the globe through subprime bundle derivatives and sovereign debt as the re-endowed crypt and encryption of history. So I managed to get these.
Wow, the last sentence was really a
yeah.